Hey everybody. So, how old is your Minecraft world? Now, this might seem like an easy question to answer. I mean, all you really need to do is open your world browser and check the last playdate. And if that isn't enough, you can inspect the save file in your Minecraft directory and check the creation date. Easy, right? Well, not really. You see, not every part of a Minecraft world is the same age. If you've ever spent time on an old survival world or visited a classic server, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. Some sections of a map can be quite old in comparison to others, and as a result, can have a very interesting history involved with them. But Minecraft doesn't save the age of specific areas or chunks in the same way it does the entire world. If you want to find out just how old any given part of your world is there really any way of knowing? Well, as it turns out, there is. And today I'm going to attempt to lay it all out. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, Minecraft's random terrain generation is one of its most well-known features, and for good reason. Having a totally random, vibrant, and unpredictable world in which to begin your adventure certainly helps to make your experience unique every time you load a new world. The algorithms behind this world generation, the inner workings of the machine, so to speak, have been altered, modified, and optimized an uncountable number of times over the past 10 years, and it's this constant evolution that's honed the game's terrain generator to a razor-sharp edge. Take the legendary beta seed, Glacier. These photos were taken on the exact same seed at the exact same location. All that changed was the version. It's clear these changes can make quite a difference. But as you might have guessed, this rapid change comes with its own side effects. See, when you load up a Minecraft world, the world doesn't really exist yet. What I mean is, the only parts of the world that exist at any given time are the ones you've visited. Using the world seed, the world generator doesn't generate terrain until you enter it. If you were to create a world in 2020, then travel to a far-off location in 2021, the area you spawned in the previous year would technically be older than the one you had journeyed to. On a recent world, this is barely noticeable. However, on server worlds and maps that have been in use for many years, these areas of varying ages start to become noticeable. A series of chunks, or 16 by 16 areas, that were loaded in, say, 2013 will look considerably different than chunks loaded in 2021. This difference is noticeable and quantifiable. As it turns out, it is this exact difference that allows us to pinpoint the age of any area. Similarly to how ice core samples are taken to view a snapshot of the atmosphere at the time of freezing, generated world chunks are essentially created as a snapshot of the world generation algorithm at the time of creation. Long story short, if you know how the algorithms changed, you can date an area based solely on how the terrain has formed. Now, you might be wondering, why? Well, for one, on very old maps, old areas may contain a deep history, and being able to tell which areas are older than others can be a useful trick. Additionally, on survival and anarchy servers like the infamous 2B2T, which has been running for over a decade and has a rich, if chaotic, history, the ability to determine the age of a chunk can actually be an important tool for identifying the paths players have taken, the ages of builds, and the legitimacy of certain claims. And on top of that, I think it's just kind of fun to do. I've taken a deep look into the history of Minecraft terrain generation, and I think I've put together a solid guide to help you find out just how old a part of your world really is. So there's going to be two sections here. The first is what I call distinct changes. These are simple, quantifiable, direct changes, usually either one way or another, that can immediately rule out certain versions or include the possibility of others. The second will be overall changes, the evolution of terrain generation as a whole for more general identification. On top of this, I'm only going to be covering everything from alpha onward, since the vast majority of worlds you encounter won't be from classic, in-dev, or inf-dev. Let's begin. We'll start with an easy one, world height. Simply put, world height is the maximum position on the y-axis a block can be placed. Now obviously in modern versions of the game this number is 255, with the height preparing to jump to 383 with the next update. However, in older chunks we can see traces of old school world height left behind. Before full release version 1.2.1, released March 1st, 2012, the world height was a minuscule 127 blocks. However, this applied not only to player building, but to world generation as well. Until this version, no piece of terrain could surpass this height. Mountains were smaller, and in older versions, they were often cut off entirely when they reached this natural limit. So, if you enter a piece of terrain, particularly a mountainous one, where no block surpasses Y127, that chunk was likely generated before March 1st, 2012, and if any natural block exceeds this limit, the opposite is true. Next up, ores. Ore generation can be split into 3 distinct phases. In the first few weeks of alpha, around late June of 2010, the only ores to generate were iron, coal, gold, and diamond. From alpha 1.0.1 to the end of beta 1.1, July 3rd of 2010 to January 12th of 2011, redstone generated alongside these ores, but lapis lazuli and emeralds were noticeably absent. Beginning in beta 1.2 on January 13th, lapis began to generate. However, it would not be until release 1.3.1 on September 1st of 2012 that emeralds would begin generating, completing the modern ore table. By either cave diving or using a third-party block tracer, you can identify the presence and absence of these ores to determine a rough age. Note that emeralds only generate in certain biomes, making them somewhat less useful. An interesting addition, plants. Plants spawn as part of the population stage of world gen after the terrain itself is formed. Like many of the features I'll discuss, these were added in stages, further segmenting the different eras of terrain. All versions prior to Alpha 106 on July 16th of 2010 featured trees as the only naturally occurring plant life. On that day, 1.0.6 saw the introduction of cactus, followed by sugarcane on July 23rd, 1.0.11, birch and spruce tree variants on January 13th of 2011, beta 1.2.0, grasses and ferns on May 26, 2011, beta 1.6.0, and finally, modern flower variants along with dark oak and acacia wood on October 25th of 2013, release 1.7.2. This can lead to one of the most stark differences between modern and early terrain, the notable lack of the grasses and tree variants we've grown used to. By observing whether or not these different plants occur, we can further narrow down the time frame. Biomes. This is kind of a situational one. Most major biome changes happen at once, but there have been a few smaller changes over the past few years that could help a bit. Some notable examples being that Mushroom Islands first appeared in full release 1.0.0 on November 18th of 2011, and Modern Jungles appeared in release 1.2.1 on March 3rd, 2012. Finding these biomes means the chunks they reside in could not have been generated before that point. A slightly more useful change is the alteration of lakes. For reference, this is what Minecraft considers to be a lake. It's honestly more like a pond, but I'm not here to debate semantics or anything. Anyway, these things first appeared in Alpha 1.2.6, December 3rd, 2010, as both lava and water variants that would spawn in any biome. By necessity, any large span of terrain completely lacking these lakes is probably from a version prior to that. If you happen to be in a desert, good news. A generation change in release 1.6.1 on July 1st, 2013 removed all water lakes from deserts, so if you happen to find one, you have a chunk that is at least that old. Now, here's a last one that isn't super useful, but it can definitely help in some very specific scenarios. The Farlands. Most of you probably know what they are. In fact, I think I've explained them in a video at some point, but essentially, the Farlands were a bugged section of terrain that occurred when the player's X or Z coordinates exceeded 12,550,821, or thereabouts, at which point the game hits its 32-bit integer limit and started really screwing things up. These bizarre monoliths were first spotted in the March 27, 2010 iteration of InfDev, and were finally fixed with Beta 1.8 on September 14th of 2011. Now obviously, the vast majority of players probably wouldn't have gotten this far out in their worlds without the use of hacks or other such exploits, but if by some bizarre stroke of fate you happen to find farland chunks on your world, you can safely say that these chunks could only have generated in that year-and-a-half window. Stone. You probably don't think about stone very often. It's just kind of there, and in a way it always has been, but not always in the exact same form. Sandstone is the desert equivalent to regular old stone, but it hasn't always been that way. Before Beta 1.2, sandstone just didn't exist, and deserts held only normal stone beneath their sands. However, it wasn't until Beta 1.3, February 22, 2011, that sandstone actually began to generate 3 blocks beneath desert surfaces. If you find yourself in a desert whose age you wish to know, do a little excavation to find out on which side of the divide it stands. Possibly even more useful is the distinction between stone variants. I'll come clean with you guys. I don't really like stone variants. Sure, they look cool, but when you're mining, they mostly just clutter up your inventory. Older players may remember a wonderful time when stone variants just didn't exist. This time just so happened to be every version prior to release 1.8.0, or September 2nd, 2014. Since stone variants are now so ubiquitous, finding a chunk with no andesite, granite, or diorite almost guarantees that it was loaded prior to this date. You may or may not have known, but your world's structures are randomly placed in much the same way every other naturally occurring feature is. And just like all other terrain features, these structures have seen their own fair share of changes over the past decade. Interestingly, the very first structure, if you don't count obsidian walls, brick pyramids, and the InDev house, was the humble dungeon, implemented all the way back in InfDev. Because of this, finding a dungeon doesn't really mean anything, since it could be from almost any version. Other structures, however, can give a bit more insight. A big update in Beta 1.8, September 14th, 2011, added mineshafts, ravines, strongholds, villages, and giant mushrooms. Finding any of these ensures the chunk can't be any older than Beta 1.8. The Desert Well, which is a feature so obscure I had honestly forgotten it existed, was added on its own in release 1.2.1 on March 1st of 2012. Everyone's favorite desert temples were added 6 months later with 1.3.1, alongside the not-as-sought-after jungle temples. Desert temples have actually gone through 2 slightly varying iterations. From September 1st, 2012 to September 1st, 2014, the orange and blue murals lining the temple were composed of wool, while release 1.8.0 changed this to terracotta on September 2nd. The slightly annoying ocean monument was implemented in the same version, if you're into that kind of thing. Finally, villages shine more insight than any of these other features combined. They've gone through a few notable changes since their actual implementation without villagers in Beta 1.8. Full release 1.4.2 on October 25th of 2012 saw potatoes and carrots added to the previously all-wheat farms. Release 1.10.0 on June 8th of 2016 replaced gravel paths with grass ones, and finally, 1.14.0 on April 23rd, 2019 replaced the fairly uniform villages with the diverse biome-dependent ones we see today. Finding a village in a chunk is good news, since each of these characteristics can give you yet another general time frame. Finally, we come to the ocean. If you're trying to date an ocean chunk, you might think that you're out of luck. Oceans have very little of the identifying features I've mentioned here. No plants, no high mountains, and very little in the way of structures. However, the ocean can tell you a bit more than you might think. Have you ever looked down at the ocean floor? If you have, you may have just noticed a few minor changes. You see, from the beginning of Alpha all the way up to release 1.7.2, October 25th, 2013, the ocean floor was composed of a spattering of dirt, sand, and clay. The oceans also rarely exceeded 30 blocks in depth, making Alpha and Beta oceans considerably more shallow on average. With 1.7.2's release, these ocean floors were changed to be entirely composed of gravel. Additionally, deep ocean variants could now spawn, exceeding 30 blocks and making post 1.7 oceans deeper on average. But that's not quite the end. In a change that's a bit more obvious, the aptly named 1.13 Update Aquatic on July 18th of 2018 added considerable life and variety to the oceans, generating ocean plants, coral, trenches, shipwrecks, and much more. Post 1.13 oceans are very easily distinguished from pre 1.13, and I don't think I even need to explain just how stark the contrast is. But there is one more change that oceans have undergone, something so minor that most probably haven't noticed it to this day. You see, all oceans in Minecraft actually spawn at a preset sea level. The sea level is uniform throughout the world, and every ocean will spawn at this exact height. And in the ever-popular Beta 1.8, that level was changed very slightly. In pre-1.8 versions, the uppermost ocean block would spawn at Y63. In post-1.8 versions, this decreases by a single block to Y62. Using this seemingly minor change, you can instantly place any ocean chunk on one side of this divide. Loot chests are weird. Technically, you can use them as yet another timeline benchmark, since they too have evolved over time, but the methodology gets a little hazy. Gunpowder, string, iron, buckets, saddles, wheat, and unenchanted golden apples have been in dungeon chests since their inception. Redstone and music discs come in Alpha 1.0.4. Cocoa beans for a short interval between Beta 1.4 and Release 1.6, enchanted books in 1.4.6, name tags and horse armor in 1.6.1, and finally, a large variety of seeds, bones, gold, coal, and notch apples in 1.9.0. The issue with dungeon chests is that, since their contents are randomly drawn from a loot table, there's no real way of knowing whether a chest is old or it just got a bum draw. Still, if no other identifying features exist, it's worth a shot. Now, you might not always have one or more of these easily quantifiable features to examine. Say you're in some old-looking terrain, but you either can't find any incriminating proof or you just want a general idea of its age without investigating deeply. Well, you're not completely out of luck. On the whole, Minecraft's overall terrain generation has gone through 4 fairly distinct phases since the beginning of Alpha. There's no direct way to tell which iteration of terrain gen you're looking at, but there are a few general characteristics to look out for. The terrain model used throughout Alpha 1.0 and 1.1 is what I refer to as InfDev world generation. Why do I call something used in Alpha InfDev world generation? Well, essentially, the terrain loaded in alpha versions 1.0.0 to 1.1.201 was virtually identical to that used in the later versions of InfDev. Short for Infinite Development, InfDev was the phase in which the infinite, but not so infinite, worlds were being designed. The terrain gen model was then carried over and used in very early versions of Alpha for about 2 months in July and September of 2010. Terrain of the InfDev era is distinctive. Flat, rolling, and fairly empty terrain interspersed with massive, unpredictable, and erratic mountains and cliffs. Terrain was fairly homogeneous, and there were no real distinctions between different areas. Deserts, taigas, and technically all biomes did not yet exist. As it turns out, the biome system that we know and love had not yet been invented, so all areas were in fact slight alterations of the core world type. A significantly high amount of floating islands, overhangs, and sprawling arches could be seen. Lakes, rivers, grasses, and ferns were absent, although these wide, shallow ponds could be found. Alpha version 1.2.0 saw the introduction of what I call the proto-biome world generation phase. In effect, from Alpha 1.2 to Beta 1.7.3, this terrain may seem a bit more familiar to early players of the game. Fairly reminiscent of InfDev generation, Proto-Biome Gen featured these same distinctive wide rolling hills, populated with unusually dramatic cliffs, mountains, and floating rocks. Lakes, grasses, and ferns did now exist, and gravel became significantly more common. Tall grass existed, but was difficult to find. However, the biggest change was the introduction of actual biomes. Though not biomes in the sense we know them today, there were now actual variations in the landscape. The proto-biomes which existed at the time included plains, desert, taiga, and forest, among others, and were chosen by a simplistic temperature rainfall system that eventually evolved into the one used today. On the whole, biomes were generally quite small, on some occasions being smaller than a chunk, and were somewhat less distinct. For instance, the boundary between a shrubland and a plains biome could be almost unrecognizable, and strange desert grassland hybrids were commonplace. So, similar to InfDev, but not quite. Beta 1.8.0 transitioned the game into something far more familiar. On September 14th of 2011, the classic biome system was adopted, and it continues to remain in use to this day, albeit with a few alterations. There isn't too much to say about this incarnation, as it fairly closely resembles modern terrain, but it does lack a number of the newer biomes introduced in later versions. Finding any of these newer biomes rules out the possibility of a chunk being from the classic biome era. It's generally accepted that this era ended with release 1.7.2, the self-titled update that changed the world, on October 25th of 2013. This version added a number of new biomes, including Savanna, Mega Taiga, Deep Ocean, Extreme Hills Plus, Roofed Forest, and more. As mentioned earlier, discovering any of these newer biomes essentially ensures that a chunk is from a version after 1.7.2. Side note. By a strange quirk of updates, this version and the one after it form a somewhat unique situation that can almost instantly identify a chunk generated in 1.7.2 with near certainty. Here's how it works. 1.7.2 introduced the new biomes, but 1.8.0 released the stone variants. This means that if the player observes a 1.7.2 biome that lacks stone variants, it can instantly be narrowed down to the 11-month period between the two versions. It's a very particular trick, but it can be seen in action in this Cell C1 video, where Cell identifies the age of a chunk containing a nether portal with this exact method. All in all, by observing overall trends in the shape of the world around you, you can generally get a good idea of the era in which that world first appeared. The final technique here is quite unique. It involves the use of a third-party application called Amidst, and involves quite a bit of work. But if you really need to know the age of a certain area, Amidst can bring a machine-like accuracy to the identification. Here's how it happens. Amidst works by using a running instance of Minecraft to pseudo-generate a representation of a world seed without actually creating it. Using the program, you can load a seed in virtually any version of the game, and identify just how it would look had it been generated by that version's algorithm. In practice, provided you have your coordinates and the world seed, you can simply take a screenshot, then use Amidst to plug the seed into various incarnations of the generator until you find one that fits. Obviously, this is a lot of effort, but if you have a major need to know the age of a build or a particular section of a world, Amidst can eliminate the need for guesswork. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Hopefully, you should now know that not all world chunks are created equal, and that if for some strange reason you seek to know the age of any one area, you now have some of the tools to do it. I'll include a link to a sort of helpful chart I made in the description below, with the hope of aiding any potential historians with whatever world dating they choose to carry out. Although it might not seem like it, Minecraft worlds can hold history, memories. So if you really want to know just how old your Minecraft world really is, don't let yourself get tripped up by stone variants. Thanks for watching.